part 1 of this 3-part series, I looked at Intel's future with an emphasis on their DGPU efforts. Today, in part 2, I'll take a look at NVidia, the current market leader. While it's hard to imagine NVIDIA's position being under threat from a new entrant, even if it's from a juggernaut like Intel, there are a couple of things that have driven NVIDIA to a crossroads of sorts, and it's possible that NVIDIA's continued dominance in the GPU market is not as clear-cut as one would think. In addition to these challenges, which we will analyze, there are also some interesting surprises that the company will likely be bringing us in the near future, including one I've personally wanted for a long while, and that could dramatically change competitive gaming. This video is sponsored by ucdkeys.com. If you are looking to put together a new PC, you will probably need a Windows 10 Pro key, and UCD Keys is currently selling them for less than $15. I've tested this service myself, and their keys work perfectly, even on Windows 11. You can also get Office 2019 keys, and they work globally. Use the coupon code C30 for an additional 30% off. Check out the links in the video description. Before we analyze NVIDIA's overall strategy for 2022 and beyond, let's take a quick look at the upcoming hardware releases. One likely announcement we should get soon from NVIDIA is the super refresh of the 3000 series of cards. I won't delve too much into that, as I think that, like with the 2000 series, we will get the fully unlocked GA100 chip with the TPC that was disabled in the 3090, now enabled in the 3090 Super, and maybe the full 1 terabit per second bandwidth of Micron's GDDR6X. So at the top end, the 3090 Super will probably offer a 5%, maybe 7% improvement over the regular 3090. And throughout the rest of the stack, I think we should see a 5 to 10% increase in performance for the Super variants compared to the TIs. So nothing to write home about, especially as availability and pricing will still be a mess. Like I said in part 1 of this series when I covered Intel, the new entrant into the GPU market will be targeting the 3070 level of performance with the top Arc Alchemist SKU, so I'm expecting NVIDIA to preemptively counter this launch by replacing the 3070 and 3070 Ti with the Super variant, with a slight bump to performance and probably an increase to the VRAM also, perhaps up to 10 GB. If NVIDIA decides to really bury Alchemist, then they could even release the 3070 Super with a cut-down 3080 GA102 chip instead of the GA104 found in the 3070 and 3070 Ti. I'm expecting to see the Super variants announced just before Intel unveils Alchemist in order to steal some of the attention away. I think Intel will be selling Alchemist for such a low price that the 3070 Super will look like a bad deal, even if it performs, say, 10 to 15% faster than Arc 7. To be honest, I think it's more interesting to think about what NVIDIA is preparing to release next year in the form of Lovelace. So that's the codename for the next consumer GPU microarchitecture that will succeed Ampere. Looking at the few details that the rumor mill has put out so far, namely Greymon and Copite on Twitter, we see that AD102 should tape out by the end of this year and release after the summer of 2022. So around a year from now, we should get the RTX 4000 series. According to these leakers, the RTX 4000s will be built on TSMC 5N or 5N Plus. Honestly, I doubt this will be the case. I don't see how TSMC would have capacity at 5nm for so many orders from so many different companies to accommodate a launch like the RTX 4000. Unless NVIDIA is planning a paper launch for Lovelace, to me it would make more sense for NVIDIA to have their next-gen data center GPUs made on TSMC and the consumer GPUs made on Samsung, just like with the current gen. Just recently, Samsung released their 5nm Exynos W920, which is fabbed using EUV, and to me that node looks like a likely candidate for Lovelace, or perhaps Samsung's newly announced 4LPP node, which is still FinFET based. Samsung Samsung's Gate-All-Around 3nm node should go into production next year, but there's no way NVIDIA would be launching their GPUs on that. NVIDIA has had success with Ampere and gained GPU market share while increasing profit margins, all while staying on a cheaper node than AMD. Why would they want to change that? People who think Samsung's process technology is inferior to TSMC's on the same node category seem to be comparing apples to oranges. If you remember, in 2016, NVIDIA released the GTX 1060 on TSMC's N16 node and the 1050 Ti on Samsung's 14 LPP node. And while the 1050 Ti had a clock limit because it lacked a PCIe power connector, the two cards ended up having similar performance per watt and clock speeds. And going all the way back to Fermi, no one blamed TSMC's 14nm process for the architecture's failures, the way they are blaming Samsung's process node for Ampere's efficiency failings now. The issues with Ampere, particularly when it comes to efficiency, have less to do with the node and more to do with the microarchitecture itself and with the use of GDDR6X. For instance, the 3070 Ti has a 70-watt higher TDP than the 3070, a massive difference in power consumption that comes from the introduction of GDDR6X in the Ti variant instead of the regular GDDR6. Another contributing factor is the fact that Ampere is a compute-focused microarchitecture which has issues with occupancy in gaming workloads. So the relative failings in Ampere don't have much to do with Samsung's 8N node, but rather with the architecture itself. Now, yields are another matter, but the consequences of bad yields, if they do exist, are not easy to evaluate in the current chip shortage climate. The point I'm trying to make is that one shouldn't think that NVIDIA can just take Ampere or its successor to TSMC and instantly get massive gains versus AMD. That's not how things work. If the leaks are correct, however, and NVIDIA is indeed launching Lovelace on TSMC 5N, then I think it will be a paper launch and remain unavailable for most of 2022 and 2023. Apple's M2 chip should be fabricated on TSMC's N5P, while AMD will be taking a huge number of 7nm orders for Zen 3D and 5nm for Zen 4. There's also MediaTek now taking the spot of third largest TSMC customer, and then Qualcomm, Broadcom, and of course now Intel is joining the party in Taiwan. This year, NVIDIA has accounted for merely 5.8% of TSMC's customer shares. So with all that, to me, it doesn't seem likely that the RTX 4000 series will be made in Taiwan, but rather in South Korea. As for performance, the RTX 4000 top SKU is presumably around twice as fast as the 3090, with 144 streaming multiprocessors and 18,432 CUDA cores, according to information from the aforementioned leakers. So that would put it in the vicinity of AMD's next-gen RDNA 3. It's too early to say if the RTX 4090 will be faster than AMD's dual-die 7900 XT, or whatever the top SKUs end up being called, but with the little information we have so far, I think they will be evenly matched, just like with this generation. There could be some surprises. Just like this generation, AMD surprised us with Infinity Cache, and NVIDIA introduced FP32 processing in both data paths to effectively double the peak processing rate for FP32 operations. So it's likely both companies will have some technical surprises for next gen as well. Looking through recent NVIDIA patents, the only thing that could hint at such innovations is a patent for tile-based caching. In this patent, we see the introduction of a screen space pipeline, a cache unit, and a tiling unit. In simple terms, the idea here is to have caches that store tile data, tiles in this case being portions of the image. This is in some sense related to AMD's Infinity Cache, where the basic idea is to improve access to data and reduce bandwidth limitations. It's hard to say if this is something NVIDIA plans to implement in Lovelace, but it's possible that NVIDIA is planning to introduce a caching system for tile-based rendering that would greatly reduce the need for a huge bus like in Ampere. This could, for instance, reduce the number of memory controllers in the RTX 4000 series, and in exchange take up a large portion of the silicon for the caches. Perhaps up to 20 or 30% of the Lovelace die could be cache. That's me speculating based on this patent, which I will link to in the description. If we want to speculate even further, it's possible that such a system could allow NVIDIA to create a chiplet system with different types of PPUs. Interestingly, NVIDIA also suggests here the use of a crossbar for communication, somewhat similar to what I discussed in a recent video covering AMD's upcoming chiplet-based GPUs, or at least in one possible implementation of that. Now, just because NVIDIA has patented something doesn't mean it will make it into a final product, and we'll look at some more patents in a second. But it's definitely worth keeping this one in mind, as these innovations sometimes translate into significant performance increases, just like we saw with Infinity Cache in RDNA 2. Now, moving beyond speculating on specs and technology, and speculating now on pricing, I think the RTX 4090 will cost at least $2,000, and the 7900 XT will go up to $1,500. Both companies have seen that with the current demand, people will pay that much for a high-end GPU, so if they can keep pushing it, they will, up to a certain point. At least this time around, we're getting a doubling in performance, assuming the leaks are true, so there's that. Now, beyond the hardware releases for later this year and next year, I think there are two major challenges that NVIDIA will face, one in the short term and one in the long term. In the short term, NVIDIA's greatest challenge will be managing expectations from both investors and customers on how it's handling the mining situation. The light hash rate, or LHR, variants of the 3060, 3070 and so on, with the exception of the 3090, are in my opinion just smoke and mirrors. NVIDIA projects this image of caring for gamers by introducing these mining limiters, but it's basically just a way of getting brownie points with the media, and I think that for the most part they are getting away with that. But if NVIDIA truly cared about gamers, then their efforts to stop miners buying their GPUs wouldn't be so half-assed. It didn't take long for NVMiner to hack the mining limiter, so obviously the limitations weren't that solid, and I suspect this is by design. Also, I recently posted a video on Twitter with a mining retailer with a huge pile of GPUs in stock, both from AMD and NVIDIA, so one can see that mining operations continue to get privileged access to GPUs. All the while, NVIDIA is posting record profits. Did the LHR variants change any of this? If NVIDIA truly cared about getting GPUs into the hands of gamers, then they would take a much harder stance against mining, not through gimping their own products for certain workloads, something I'm completely against, but by properly controlling their distribution channels to cut direct access from miners and mining retailers, and they would also cut allocation to AIBs and outlets that are serving that market. Another option would be to sell GPUs only through NVIDIA.com with a maximum allocation per customer. I mean, a lot of things could be done, and NVIDIA is choosing to do the most half-assed and easy to bypass ones for a reason. They're trying to get you to believe they care about gaming, all the while still selling to miners. But you can't have your cake and eat it, so this leaves NVIDIA at a crossroads. How can the company manage their image as gamer-friendly while still posting record profits every quarter thanks to crypto miners? Once gamers realize that miners aren't to blame for the shortage, but rather the hardware makers themselves, I think pressure will mount and force NVIDIA to take a stance. It's possible that the company will try to ride the wave until crypto sees another crash. If you want to learn about Bitcoin cycles, I suggest you watch my recent video on the topic. The cycles are repeating exactly as I explained. Recent reports suggest that NVIDIA will reduce GPU supply by 30% this month, and that falls in line with the Bitcoin cycles I described in the aforementioned video I did on the topic. If that's the case, then NVIDIA wants to protect itself from a possible collapse in cryptos, and then introduce the super variants to entice gamers to buy those instead of buying regular 30 series in the used market, while at the same time taking some of the attention away from Intel's Arc Alchemist launch. It all seems to fall in line perfectly for the company. That is, if cryptos do indeed collapse. It will be interesting to see how NVIDIA will handle all of this. They're risking putting their dominant position at risk if there's another crypto rally and the boom lasts for a few more months or even a couple of more years. That would leave the door wide open for Intel to fill the market with affordable 3070 competitors. Honestly, I really hope Intel comes in and kicks the door of this duopoly down. The market desperately needs it. The second challenge that NVIDIA will face, and this is more of a long-term affair, has to do with both AMD and Intel now having a whole platform to push, so that CPU plus GPU would benefit in combining the two, while NVIDIA only has the GPU part of this equation, at least for now. There is a common interest from Intel and AMD in seeing each other succeed. I'm pretty sure AMD wants Alchemist to be a success. If both Intel and AMD can offer a CPU plus GPU combo to system integrators, then it's going to be hard for NVIDIA to get their GPUs into laptops, one of the growing PC segments. Intel and AMD can push NVIDIA out by giving OEMs favorable prices when combining GPU plus GPU of the same manufacturer, while NVIDIA is left at the mercy of both of their competitors, probably with leftover, less appealing designs. The same will happen with desktop SIs, although to a lesser extent. In the DIY market, there is also an incentive from Intel and AMD for enthusiasts to combine CPUs and GPUs from the same brand, with advantageous technologies like smart access memory on AMD platforms and similar offerings from Intel. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. I'm confident that in the coming months we will see Intel offering exclusive AI features for applications like Photoshop, Premiere, and Topaz Labs apps, and perhaps even in games, when you combine an Intel CPU with an Intel GPU. Check out part 1 of this series if you want to understand how that will work. How can NVIDIA possibly compete with this? Lowering prices seems to be out of the question when investor expectations are now at an all-time high, so that leaves NVIDIA with having to come up with their own CPUs, either by licensing x86 or by acquiring VIA, or what seems to be the most likely scenario, by moving on to ARM-based systems. The ARM acquisition seems to be facing some complications from regulators, although to be honest I think it will still go through. It might just take longer than expected. Even if the acquisition doesn't go through, we already saw the NVIDIA Grace ARM CPU, which is a data center product. The data center is often a good indicator of what will trickle down to the consumer segment, and I think NVIDIA's strategy will likely be to develop a consumer-centric ARM-based CPU to compete with Intel and AMD's platform strategies. With Microsoft now having a more mature version of Windows for ARM, and with Valve releasing a Linux-based operating system next year that will be compatible with every Steam game, including competitive shooters that have anti-cheat technology, NVIDIA can offer gamers a valid alternative to Windows plus AMD or Intel. And in fact, I think NVIDIA could offer a better platform for gaming if they decide to go with ARM plus Linux. The issue here is that if you do more than gaming on your PC, then it will continue to be extremely hard to move over to Linux without missing out on crucial applications like Photoshop and Premiere. So NVIDIA is faced with some tough decisions. There's a real chance that the company will just crumble if they fail to offer a compelling CPU plus GPU platform like their competitors are doing. There's also the ever-elusive AI revolution, which so far the company has failed to bring to gaming in a meaningful manner, the exception being DLSS. Speaking of which, I found 2 NVIDIA patents that suggest the company will be introducing a new version of DLSS with a couple of key features. One is a new form of anti-aliasing, which uses ray tracing to identify complex pixels that might benefit from anti-aliasing. In simple terms, this is a technique that corrects TAA failed pixel renders with a combination of ray tracing and FXAA, so the cost of anti-aliasing is greatly reduced, resulting in a better image rendered in less time. It seems to be that this patent has implications beyond DLSS, particularly in image recognition and image generation in visualization industries, but the implications for gaming are nevertheless promising. In fact, the patent refers this exact scenario where adaptive ray tracing for temporal anti-aliasing is used to address the limitations of TAA in games. The objective of this patent is using ray tracing to remove the ghosting and flickering that happens with TAA, and that is particularly evident when using DLSS in motion, and also to remove some of the spatial noise. The cost of this process is further reduced by feeding super-sampled results back into the TAA buffer. This patent also mentions the use of the infamous coprocessor to accelerate this whole process. Another recent patent describes temporal spatial denoising in ray tracing applications. This patent is aimed at lighting and addresses temporal issues in real-time ray tracing and DLSS, like ghosting and other artifacting. So it seems to me that NVIDIA will be introducing a new version of DLSS that's even more connected to achieving better performance in real-time ray tracing. This seems contrary to what one would expect now that FSI is being so widely and so rapidly adopted. I would have expected NVIDIA to open DLSS, or at least offer an open source version of it. I'll be be keeping an eye on patent filings in the coming months. Perhaps something else will pop up. Now, the final patent that I think is worth looking at is something that came as a bit of a surprise. It might not be interesting to everyone, but if you play competitive games, or perhaps more importantly, if you stop playing competitive games because of the constant cheating, then this might be of interest. This patent describes a process that uses one or more neural networks to analyze gameplay in a competitive game and infer if there's cheating taking place. A fairness manager, which sits between the game server and the gamer, compares the image being displayed in the gamer's screen to what is expected to be shown. So if a gamer is supposed to be seeing a solid wall but instead sees an enemy through that wall, then the system recognizes that as wall hacking. Similarly, if the aiming reticle is supposed to be aligned with an opponent when a shot is fired and a bullet connects, yet the system sees that the reticle is pointing to something else entirely, the fairness manager concludes that the gamer is aimbotting, and so on. This is a genius way of detecting cheating in games. I stopped playing Battlefield primarily because it's a game made by EA and I refuse to give that company any money, but also because of DICE's inability to clamp down on cheating. A system like this one proposed by NVidia could finally clean up competitive shooters. Of the many patents that NVidia has put out, this one stands out to me because this is a great example of how I expect artificial intelligence to be used to improve gaming experiences. And to me, this is precisely the sort of thing that NVidia needs to be doing to cement their position in the market. AI features that elevate the gaming experience, and in other cases visuals, beyond just ray traced effects that one can barely notice. To conclude, I think NVIDIA will have a very challenging 2022. Intel and AMD's ability to offer a synergistic platform of CPU plus GPU should really raise questions of NVIDIA's ability to remain relevant, especially now that AMD has caught up with them in the high end. And NVIDIA's half-assed efforts to clamp mining seem to me a dangerous game to be playing, and one that could come back to bite them. Finally, there's hope for the company's future if a serious investment is done into AI applied to gaming. That's what I would like to see more of. If there's someone who can take these challenges head on, it's Jensen Huang. Stay tuned for part 3 where we'll look at AMD's prospects for 2022. This video was made possible by my awesome patrons. With YouTube revenue almost non-existent, your patronage is vital, so consider joining my Patreon for just $1 per month and get exclusive access to the Cortex Discord server, where I often share exclusive info on upcoming hardware. Be a part of a healthy and respectful community of enthusiasts by giving your support. If you can't contribute financially, then give this video a like and share it with others. Knowledge is power, so share the knowledge. Thanks for watching, and until the next one.